I'm a Firewatch lookout and I think I've made a terrible mistake, Part 2. By Redditor Dark Night Tales. By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of a red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fear-stressed mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing, there was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily, driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, and was accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. When the first dim light of dawn started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain I was alone. Once I was satisfied that I was alone for the moment, I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone was trying to respond. A combination of the storm and the interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive and with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay. Probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. No rifle, no radio, no GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. You know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned the lights off in a basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a darkened and lonely parking lot. It's the feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are. It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled detritus that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour I moved at this pace, aware with every rasping lungful of breath that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, knowing that pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever haunted my trail to find me. What would happen then? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk. Then, reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No, not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught the flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that the fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though, and my feet started forward again on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday morning. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that a forestry department jeep sat parked near my fence-enclosed tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise, I realized after a moment. After not hearing back from me, I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire Sandar team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook myself of the sudden chill as best I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but the thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wonder how close I came to having my life ended in a bright flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trapdoor and let it drop closed behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing from my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair trimmed close. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might groom. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki forestry service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle I'd had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier, I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual when out in the bush. Bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way towards taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I supposed, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and I placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely, "but you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damned lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here. When I poured and handed him one of the glasses, however, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damned fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire? That old mining camp?" I asked. "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out here. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug. A long time before the 19th century, at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in a storm, I'm guessing." "Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows, as if to say what an understatement that was. Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. Did you find the campers at least? I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. No, I tracked them to the mine, but lost them in the cave. I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor and was out of my chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him, as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. You went into the cave, he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. Yeah, I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already, not sure when or by who. I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers, and I think it followed me out. Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in a gulp. When he spoke again, it seemed far away, distant. Kuwatami. That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Angler is what the white man called it, among other names. Kuwatami? He nodded. False brother, lying man, or something like that. Hell, I don't know, what do I look like, a translator? It means bad, no matter what language you speak. It means something is out there that isn't supposed to be. Something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten. It was then that he stood and grabbed up his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. I need to get back to my tower and make a call. Now. I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. Why not use mine? Billy shook his head. Sorry, John, but it doesn't work that way. Special phone. Special number. I just hope I'm not too late. I started to stand. I'll go with you, I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. No, you stay here. Strap on your handgun and make sure it's loaded. His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay here alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out there. Billy, I can go with you. I can help Dash, I started to argue, but was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step towards me, and I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. You will stay in your goddamn tower and you will follow your orders, he roared, and I unconsciously took a step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaken nod in acknowledgement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, and keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates. A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. John. I heard Billy call from below and went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you, he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up and a moment later drive off down the rough service road towards his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again. Safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before but saw only the rough service road and dense impenetrable tree line beyond that. Probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby. just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage. Waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows, but if it was there, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves. But I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I had already drank, and quickly decided that the last thing I needed was for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled. Right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours. I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cupboard to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way and then remembered the old, weathered journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I had lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large, a little larger than my hand and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front, except for a simple grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the first page. From the pocket of Andrew Robinson, it read. The writing was neat and compact, and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that this Andrew Robinson had been keeping. July 23, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sakwahi, our Pawnee tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit, I was skeptical at the yarn the old trapper had spun in the crowded confines of the common house in Dunn Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never doubted a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit to a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. July 24, 1891. Our small troop of intrepid adventurers made camp in the center of Leclerc last night. Though the cabins likely would have been more comfortable, I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sakwahi, our ever-courageous and stolid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding to queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder at what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typically infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp Leclerc, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We, all of us, raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nigh invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight. A barricaded tunnel entrance had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or adit dug in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it, but the professor dismissed it as a triviality. So the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. July 25, 1891. Sakwahi is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to us all, but none more so than to the professor, with whom the Pawnee tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. July 25, 1891 Addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that the bones seem intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the adit tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall. Surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill, unmoving, but our excitement at this discovery allayed any concerns or discomfort this might have caused. The professor directed us to set a secondary camp in this new chamber, which will be used as a staging point for further exploration. So we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies from our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded a start to the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight, despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. July 26, 1891. Another shock when we awoke this morning. O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp. For his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all, now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system. In the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone and then losing himself again trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. July 27, 1891. I am at my wit's end and am unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I have seen nothing of our missing companion or of the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them this long. Without other means of illumination to guide their return, I fear they are hopelessly lost. I, myself, had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my own waning light. I must admit with no little embarrassment some reluctance to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds. By heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night, as I dimmed my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first it was only an indistinct and muted echo that may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound. distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. But then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took up my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that had swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant calls of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me, but I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself at seeing ghouls where none existed, and was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated. But I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words. But it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back to me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice. I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern at that moment. Could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He had always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous peoples without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I am not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. Not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that I will take in its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I had just read. How was it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped at my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal on the floor. Heart pounding, I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight. As I spoke, my eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkened thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy. The self-assured authority that had filled his tone before was strangely absent now, replaced with something else. Fear? I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "Where do you think, Billy?" "I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside of my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I'd intended. "I'm not outside of your fucking tower." Why dash, I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me in that moment. I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12, barely visible over the darkening blanket of green. Was that a gunshot?